Good morning, everyone, and nice to resume our learning together. The title, this morning's title, is it remains a work in progress. I kept changing it even until between the time I wrote the source sheet and the time I sent the email. The idea of accuracy required for Torah scrolls and baptisms. And this was a case where I saw a headline and I knew I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't have all the pieces together. It was a work in progress as to the Jewish connection. And it relates to a headline you see on the source sheet. It was something that appeared a couple of weeks ago. This is from NPR 2 weeks ago. It appeared all over, and there was a follow-up piece just done yesterday. Arizona priests use one wrong word for baptisms for decades. They're all invalid. And you wonder, like, what's going on? It's kind of, then of course, my comedic sense is, a rabbi and a priest, a baptism, maybe there's a circumcision line here somewhere, what's going on? So here's the relevant facts. A Catholic priest in Arizona has resigned after he was found to have performed baptisms incorrectly throughout his career, rendering the rite invalid for thousands of people. Catholic Diocese of Phoenix announced on its website that it determined after careful study that the Reverend Andre Arango had used the wrong wording in baptisms performed up until June 17th, 2021. He had been off by a single word. During baptisms in both English and Spanish, Arango used the phrase, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit." He should have said, "I baptize you," not "we baptize you," the diocese explained. It is not the community that baptizes a person and incorporates them into the church. Rather, it is, right, Christ alone who presides at all sacraments, and therefore that's who baptizes. If you were baptized using the wrong words, that means your baptism is invalid and you are not baptized. Diocese spokesperson Katie Burke told NPR over email that Arango is believed to have used the incorrect word since the beginning of his priesthood in 1995. I do not have an exact number of people affected, but I believe they number in the thousands, she added. Right? It may be something that's lost in translation. No matter if it's off by a word, it's all invalid. And article continues that as far as the diocese is aware, all of the other sacraments that Arango conferred are valid, but because baptism is the sacrament that grants access to all the others, a botched baptism could invalidate any subsequent sacraments, including confirmation, marriage, and holy orders. What this means for you is if your baptism was invalid and you've received other sacraments, you may need to repeat some or all of those sacraments after you are validly baptized as well, the diocese said. The diocese said, while the situation may seem legalistic, the words, materials, and actions are crucial aspects of every sacrament, and changing any of them makes them invalid. For example, if a priest uses milk instead of wine during the consecration of the Eucharist, the sacrament is not valid, it said. The milk would not become the blood. So there's a lot to unpack, I believe, in this article. One, just the fact that one word, a mistake is made, you have to redo it. And then what about the fact that there's a pyramid of all the other sacraments built upon this? Just the last line, if you use milk instead of wine, of course, it's not considered, right, the Eucharist. Just brings to mind, there's a story where we read this past Shabbos, Parsha Shkolim. So the four Parshas that are the on-ramp to Purim and then Pesach. So there's Pesach of Purim, of course, is coming first, but once you hit Purim, you're in the 30 days to Pesach, so you start thinking about Passover. And the first rule in the Shulchan Aruch for Pesach is what's called ma'os chitim, which is money for wheat, the idea that we have to make sure that everyone has enough financial resources in order to pay for the Pesach materials. The wheat of Shmura matzah is very expensive, so you have to make sure everyone has what they need. And so there's a story they tell about Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, who was overseeing the fund, and someone came over to the rabbi said, "Rabbi, I have a Passover question." When he was there to pick up some of the funds, he was a needy person, but he said, "I have a question. Can I use 4 cups of milk instead of 4 cups of wine?" right? And that's why the story came to mind after that last line in the article. Can you use 4 cups of milk instead of 4 cups of wine? The rabbi said, no. The Talmud actually discusses that you really need to use wine. It has to be something intoxicating. It has to be something that adds joy. And you may like milk, but you have to use wine. And then the rabbi, handed the person the funds and gave him gave him twice the funds. And his assistant said, Rabbi, why'd you give him twice the funds of everybody else? He said, if he's asking whether or not he can use milk for the 4 cups of wine, if he's using milk, that means he doesn't have any meat at the Seder. Because if you're going to be using milk at the Seder, it means he doesn't even have the main course. So I realized he had additional meat, so I gave him some more. So that's the Jewish version of using milk instead of wine. And in Judaism as well, you must use the wine. But what about some of the other elements of this story and how it would apply within the Jewish tradition? So just before we look at a couple of examples, the one thing that stands out is that in Judaism you can think of a lot of situations where you have to do something over again, but it's not always because of one word, right? So if you take, for example, a circumcision. Right, if a circumcision is done improperly, right, it's an action that's done improperly. Judaism is much more focused on rituals being acts instead of words. Now there are some which are obvious mistakes. For example, if you have bread and you say Barei Pri Hagafen on the bread, it doesn't work. It's the wrong declaration. So there's something along that we do have rituals where words are recited, and we'll give an example within the prayer at the end. But really, for one word to be different, that for the essentially the ceremony or the procedure to go forward and only one word be missing to have to do it all over again, it's not so simple to find examples, right? We always want things to be done correctly and accurately, but to have one word invalidate and for that one word to then impact subsequent ones, right? Based on this, if someone had been baptized in 1997 and then, 20 years later is getting married, the religious marriage ceremony based on the church's determination is not correct because they had the wrong baptism, right? If someone had the wrong bris, if someone made the wrong bracha, or said laid the wrong parsha, we don't have this pyramid that one is necessarily built upon the other. So I thought that was very interesting. Also within Judaism, we often invoke what's called b'di'evet, after the fact. We have these two terms. Lichatchila means ideal, and b'di'evet means after the fact. So we have the correct, proper, ideal way for us to perform a mitzvah. And then we say, well, after the fact, if you did it somewhat incorrectly, maybe it can still count. And reading the level of detail required here, it would seem that this is b'di'evet, after the fact. Maybe if they were living their lives in consonance with what their sacraments had been about, right? Why should the one word make all the difference? Well, I'll leave that open as a question. We'll just see the Jewish side and maybe come back to it, because I think it really does relate to some of the fundamental differences between Judaism and Christianity. And just finally, the last couple of sentences where the spokesperson is talking about that it seems legalistic, but everything is important. I think that does resonate in a Jewish perspective. The idea of that the actions matter and that the level of the actions matter really does matter. It is a fundamental element within Judaism, I think much more so than in Christianity. And we'll give an example of that at the end as well. So any reactions, thoughts, comments before we jump into some Jewish sources about one word mattering? And if there are examples of this that people have or want to raise that don't get brought up, feel free to do so. Okay, so when I saw the headline, because of this one word makes all the difference, Howard, you have a question?
No.
No, Rabbi, I'm just curious, the source here. I would think this is an issue that would go right up to the cardinals in Rome. I mean, this is one.
So it was addressed by the the College of Doctrines and Rules, and they were the ones who decided that this had to all be redone.
Wow.
So, yeah. So,
Well,
like you get your money back from the party that you planned then too. I don't know. There's a whole host of issues, but it is interesting that the Catholic Church does have kind of a halachic authority, or a body that deals with these issues.
well, it's interesting because, you know my journey. I come from the ultra Catholic to a relatively new and learning Jewish woman, but I find that it's almost like, yes, there is a structure inside that Catholic Church, which we've seen in the area of pedophilia, that thwarts the truth or takes it right to the top. Whereas in Judaism, it's if you like the rabbi, then you follow that rabbi, and where's the court of appeals?
Right. So look, as we'll see, there is a path. There are legal requirements. Much less so in Christianity. Judaism is much more built on law and action than Christianity.
Yeah, and word.
And that's why I think it's harder to find these types of examples in Judaism. But let's see a few that I think that when I hear the headline of one word makes all the difference, I immediately go to the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. In Judaism, there's a story. There's a snippet of that story in source number 1 from the Talmud in Gittin. And it tells a story that Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Now, there was a certain man whose friend was Kamsa and whose enemy was named Bar Kamsa. He once made a large feast and said to his servant, "Go bring me my friend Kamsa." The servant went and mistakenly brought his enemy Bar Kamsa. Right, and this is the famous story that Bar Kamsa is surprised to receive the invitation because he did not have a good relationship with the host. And then he shows up at the party, and the host is livid. How can Bar Kamsa be there? Kamsa was supposed to be there. And there's a whole back and forth, and the host wants to kick Bar Kamsa out of the party, and Bar Kamsa doesn't want to be embarrassed. He offers to basically pay for the whole party. The host kicks him out anyway. Bar Kamsa swears revenge, and that vengeance process culminates with introducing a libel against the Jews, so that the Romans, the Jews are rebelling against Rome, and Rome, in the way this story is told, this is what leads Rome to oppress the Jews to fight back, the temple to be destroyed. The end of the story, as the Talmud says, because of that one little word bar, because of that one mistake, the entire temple was destroyed. And so, this idea of words mattering, certainly has its has Jewish resonance. This story, I think, in particular, says it all, because on account of one small word, our world changed. Because of the difference between Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, a series of events transpired that changed the course of Jewish history, changed the course of world history. And this fits in with a Jewish biblical approach to speech, right? The idea, Chaim Mavet v'Chaim biyad halashon. We read in the book of Proverbs that life and death are on the tongue. In Jewish thought, the idea of human beings being imbued with a living spirit from God has been traditionally understood as they have it's what's called in Bereshit Ruach Chaim. Spirit of life is understood in the rabbinic tradition as Ruach Mimalila, speech. And so this idea that speech does distinguish us, and speech does make a tremendous amount of difference, and speech does have, there's a lot of responsibility in how we speak. Lashon hara, motzi shem ra, telling the truth, not spreading rumors, not telling tales, right? We believe in the power of speech, and the rabbis have taught us. One small word changes the world. So the concept exists, and that words are important, but legally, in a ritual sense, where might they be important? And so I think some people are probably thinking things like that along the lines of documents, like, for example, the ketubah, right? The ketubah is written a very specific way, or the get, the Jewish divorce, being written a very specific way. And there is truth to that, that one word could make all the difference, but there are a couple of differences, I think, between the spoken word and the written word. One, when something needs to be written a certain way, it generally will be written a certain way. Like, for example, a get. If a Jewish divorce is being written by someone who knows how to write a Jewish divorce under the appropriate rabbinical supervision, the rabbinical court, it's a 12-line document that you basically follow the script and you get it right. You don't generally, the reason why you choose people who know what they're doing is so they don't make the mistake. And there's also a smaller playing field to make the mistake. The ketubah, there's some flexibility built in, as well as the fact that if a mistake is found in the ketubah, that doesn't invalidate the marriage. It just means a new ketubah has to be written. And so, while there, in Judaism, in Jewish ritual, in Jewish documents in particular, we are concerned about accuracy, it doesn't necessarily mean the whole tower collapses because of a mistake made with a word. There may be repercussions, there may be ways you have to make something up, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have that similar essential or existential all comes crumbling down that's mentioned in this NPR article. When it could make a difference, I think has to do with a Torah scroll, right? A Torah scroll has to be written exactly and as accurately as demanded by Jewish law. And in that respect, if a Torah scroll has one missing letter or one mistaken letter, it can be problematic. And this is something that interestingly, is not really found in the Bible, right? The Torah doesn't tell us the rules for writing a Torah scroll. We rely a lot on tradition, a tradition that essentially started when Moses wrote the first Torah scrolls, right? He had the first Torah scroll, each of the tribes was given a Torah scroll, and that became the template, the model going forward. But that creates an awesome responsibility. As is mentioned in source number 2 in the Talmud Eruvin, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel said in the name of Rabbi Meir, when I studied with Rabbi Akiva as his disciple, I used to put iron sulfate into the ink, and he did not say anything to me. When I came to study with Rabbi Yishmael, he said to me, my son, what is your vocation? I replied, I'm a scribe who writes Torah scrolls. He said to me, my son, be careful in your vocation, as your vocation is heavenly service, and care must be taken lest you omit a single letter or add a single letter out of place, and you will end up destroying the whole world in its entirety. Addition or omission of a single letter can change the meaning from truth to death, right? The word truth is emet. If you leave out the aleph, you have met, which means death, right? So there is the encouragement of the scribe, no pressure or anything, but basically life and death are at the stroke of a pen. And the whole idea of reinforcing the significance and the importance of writing the Torah scroll accurately, it emerges from here. This is the initial, the Talmudic discussion. Interestingly, the Talmud in Menachot has a conversation about Torah scrolls, but it actually seems to be something that was passed down more orally, even longer than the Talmud. Just a note of Talmudic literature, right? You have the Bible, and then you have an oral tradition, and the Mishnah are some of the decisions of the oral tradition that were these were the discussions that the rabbis had been having for generations that were then edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in the year 200. And then you have your first book of Jewish law. You have those laws continue to be discussed for several centuries, and that gives you the Gemara, the Talmud. You also, in addition to the Talmud, there are what are called Masechtot Kitanot, minor tractates. And these were compiled and edited post the rest of the Talmud. Like, for example, people who study Daf Yomi, the Masechtot Kitanot, the minor tractates are not part of the Daf Yomi. They have a lot of halachic significance, but they're not viewed as authoritatively to the halachic process as the Talmud. But it does record in certain areas, because it deals with certain topics more directly, it is helpful. So one of them is called Tractate Sofrim. Now, who are the Sofrim? Scribes. So this Tractate Sofrim is a very good source of information with regards to anything that the scribes are writing, Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah. And we read here in source number 3, between lines, there must be left the space of a line. Between the words, the space of a letter. Between letters, that of a hairbreadth. Between columns, the space of the width of a thumb. If a word at the end of the column was copied at the beginning of the next column of the scroll is disqualified. If the letters were mixed or if a break was made in the middle of a word, the selection may not be read from it. It is permitted to insert between columns part of a word of 5 letters, or one may not write 2 letters within the column and 3 without, but it is not so with a short word. If part of a longer word, however, forms a short word of 2 letters on its own, it's forbidden to insert it between the columns, right? What happens if you have to be a little bit unjustified, right? Those of us who use Microsoft Word, we're used to this, how it was spacing, single spacing, double spacing, justification, unjustification, usually justified. What if there's an exception? What if the words that go into the margin, into the space between the columns, spell out its own word? These are all the minutiae that a sofer, scribe, has to be concerned with regard to accuracy. And it could be that if these rules are broken, you end up with a Torah that's not usable. So where one word can make all the difference, where the accuracy makes all the difference in a ritual, a Torah scroll is an example that if you encounter a Torah scroll that is not done this way, it is not usable. Sometimes it can be fixed, sometimes it can't be used anymore. Again, what does that mean? What about all the times it was read and blessings were recited? Okay, mistakes were made. We're not saying this is not acceptable as a situation, but it doesn't have the reverberations that the bar mitzvah boy who read from that Torah is still bar mitzvah. It doesn't have that sequential issue with regards to any type of aftershocks and after effects. But I think a Torah scroll is a place where Jewish tradition and Jewish law does have a significant amount invested in accuracy. And while we're talking about the Torah's accuracy, it is interesting to note just how accurate, or just how that tradition of accuracy has played out over the generations, because Jews have different types of practices. Jews, of course, have different opinions. When it comes to the Torah scroll, we've done pretty well, right? Source number 4 on the second page, an article from Ish Torah. Maintaining the accuracy of any document as ancient and as large as the Torah is very challenging, even under the best of circumstances. But consider that throughout history, Jewish communities were subject to widespread persecution and exile. Over the last 2,000 years, Jews have been spread to the 4 corners of the world, from Yemen to Poland, from Australia to Alaska. Other historical factors make the accurate transmission of the Torah all the more difficult. For example, the destruction of the temple 1900 years ago saw the dissolution of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish central authority, which traditionally would unify the Jewish people in any case of any disagreements. Let's investigate the facts as we have them today. If we collect the oldest Torah scrolls and compare them, we can see if any garbling exists, and if so, how much. How many letters are there in the Torah? 304,805, 79,000 words. If you were to guess how many letters of these 304,805 you think are in question, most people would guess anywhere between 25 and 1,000. The fact is that after all the trials and tribulations, communal dislocations and persecutions, only the Yemenite Torah scrolls contain any difference from the rest of world Jewry. A total of 9 letter differences are found in their scrolls. These are all spelling differences. In no case do they change the meaning of the word. For example, how would you spell the word color? In America, it's C-O-L-O-R. In England, it's C-O-L-O-U-R. Such is the nature of the few spelling differences between the Torah scrolls today. The results over thousands of years are remarkable. So the accuracy is something that has remained pretty constant. Not perfect, but we do have a template as to what is considered accurate when it comes to a Torah scroll. With the Yemenite Jews, it is interesting that many scholars have suggested that the Yemenite tradition may be the most authentic when it comes to Hebrew pronunciation, Torah scrolls, and the like. And it's everyone else who got off, who went off a little bit in terms of errors. It's very interesting, in particular, because if you've ever heard the Yemenite pronunciation, they have sounds that the rest of the Jewish community does not have in terms of some of the letters. For example, they have a j sound in the gimel. It's gimel, not just gimel. And they have a th sound, right? We have tuf and suf for those who pronounce Ashkenazis pronunciation. In the Yemenite tradition, there's a th sound. There's a tuf and a thuf, right? Sometimes you wonder, why are there two letters if they both sound the same? Now, there's certain grammatical differences, but the Yemenite tradition does seem to be, does seem to have a certain authenticity, whether it's 100% accurate or not. You can't be 100%, but we see that we're pretty accurate when it comes to maintaining a tradition of what the Torah letters must be and how they must be written. Now, how do you check? And now you can start wondering, if you have these 304,805 letters, it's a lot to write. It's a lot to write correctly, and you have to be accurate. So that's partially why a Torah scroll costs a lot of money. It's labor intensive to be written, and then in order to ensure the accuracy, it has been proposed that the sofer have to review the Torah 3 different times to make sure that it is 100% accurate. Just was wondering, with one of the classes we gave earlier this year, what about having a computer check it? Now, computer checks of Torah scrolls have been around for a while. We talked a little bit about artificial intelligence. What about computers that could write Torah scrolls? And we said that lacks the human intent or intention that the sofer possesses. But without rehashing all of that, there's an interesting blurb from the Sofer Center, which sells Torah scrolls, when they talk about the ways to make sure your Torah is written accurately. In addition to Sofer's examination, we strongly recommend you have a computer checking done as well. Although examiners do the best they can, humans can make mistakes which the computer can catch. However, it is not a substitute for the manual examination. Although the computer can successfully catch missing and substituted letters, it cannot determine letters with problematic shape if they are kosher or not, or do the actual repairs if necessary. That can only be accomplished through meticulous manual examination by qualified sofer. So the idea of having a computer check, can up the level of certainty, but it may be too technical it may be done in too technical fashions. A certain flexibility, or I like to use the word flexigidity. There's flexible with regard to what needs to be done rigidly. So there's a certain flexigidity of using the human being who's able to be rigid as necessary and flexible when allowed. But this idea of trying to be accurate, when all is said and done, the accuracy of a Torah scroll is not something we can necessarily count on as being absolutely certain about. This is something that comes up, that the scribe writing a Torah scroll does not make a bracha. And there's a commandment, there's a mitzvah to write a Torah scroll. So why doesn't the scribe say the bracha that Asher Kiddushanu Misosevet Zivanu Al Ksiva Sefer Torah? Why isn't there a blessing over it? So the Chatam Sofer, Moshe Sofer in the 19th century points out, there are many times when the traditional Torah text is not identical with the text cited in the Talmud. And since the rule is that a Sefer Torah that is missing even a single letter cannot be called a Sefer Torah, it is impossible to make a blessing over writing it under any circumstances. Even with all the accuracy demanded, even with all the tradition that we have, and even with all the checking that we do, and even with a computer check, the Chatam Sofer points out that, look, we've had Torah scrolls for 3,000 years, and we've had so much going on. Yes, we have rules about how a Torah scroll is written, but those rules are not enough to ensure that it's 100% accurate, because there have been deviations. There are those 9-letter deviations. There are other examples. I spoke about it last Shavuos, where Rashi seems to have a text that's not the text that's found in the Torah. So because of all that, we try to be as accurate as possible, but in a sense, we demand, if accuracy is required, we demand such a high level of accuracy that we're not even able to attain it. Right? Talk about here in the baptisms, they found a mistake from the I to the we, and the whole house of cards came tumbling down. Our accuracy is never 100% accurate enough to begin with in the first place, and therefore we're never sure. So that so we can never be sure. Source number 7, just a just a note from this, the idea of artificial intelligence, that just the last line, a robot can never attain the status of a human being, and therefore it cannot perform these religious functions. Is, just with regards to that aspect. Now, so that's with the Torah scroll. Accuracy, 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 as much as possible. Never really going to be 100% accuracy or certainty. As was mentioned, if a mistake is found, mistakes can be corrected. It doesn't, the house of cards doesn't come tumbling down. So I wanted to mention, what about prayer? Because in prayer, we try to be very meticulous. We try to be very careful about the text that we say. We're familiar with the fact that if it's a special day and a prayer is omitted, you have to repeat it. But that's a whole prayer. That's a special occasion. What about the idea of one word making all the difference? So the Talmud has an example that in source number 8, one who recites modim modim. If a person says, we give thanks, we give thanks. It's in that end, the blessing towards the end of the Shmon Esrei, right? The 17th blessing of, the 18th blessing of Thanksgiving, which says modim anachnu. And so the Mishnah says, if someone says, instead of saying modim anachnu lach, says modim modim anachnu lach, give thanks twice, right? You silence him. Now this is an improper, you can't do that. Now the Talmud goes on to talk about that there's a concern that if a person says modim modim, that they are praying to multiple gods. But here we have an example where you got to get it right. If you don't get it right, if you say an extra word, the house of cards comes tumbling down for the prayer. Now, there is this technical example, and the example does find expression in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. But I think here we begin to pivot that within Judaism, it's not exclusively about the action of the word. We're worried about the intention and the station of the person saying the word. So to go back to the original baptism disqualification example, it's less about what was said, but something's wrong. We're more concerned that the person who officiates or does who leads the ritual has to be appropriate. So, because, for example, when we start talking about unsavory characters from a religious perspective, sinners or apostates or people who who present themselves as religious but really are not, and they're involved in performing rituals. They may have done the ritual properly, but Judaism is not only interested in the outcome, it's concerned with how we got there, who did the writing. So source number 9 as an example. A Torah scroll, tefillin, or mezuzah that are written by a heretic, a Samaritan, a Gentile, a Canaanite slave, a woman, a minor, or a Jewish apostate, are unfit as it is stated, and you shall bind them for a sign on your arm, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house. From this juxtaposition, one can derive the following. Anyone who's included in the mitzvah binding the phylacteries, one who's both obligated and performs the mitzvah, is included in the class of people who may write Torah scrolls, phylacteries, and mezuzah. Anyone who's not included in the mitzvah binding is not included in the class of people who may write sacred texts. So the idea at times, if we're looking for what Judaism is concerned with some of these rituals and what will determine whether the rituals were done properly isn't always how the ritual was done, but who performed the ritual. So, for example, and we spoke a little bit about this a couple of times. There was a case in Israel of a rabbi who was involved in religious activities, and it turned out that he was a missionary. And then there was another, that what happens in that type of a situation? Someone who is, we talk about Jews for Jesus. Those types of people who are involved in performing these rituals, right? The ritual, what happens to the ritual? So what happens to someone like that officiates at a marriage, right? That officiation is invalid. Now, we said before, in cases of mistakes or where details of a marriage ceremony aren't performed, you have to. It doesn't mean that they're not married anymore. You have to maybe redo certain things or rewrite a ketubah. But we see that maybe Judaism has prescribed policies and details that need to be followed for accuracy. If they're not, sometimes there's a way around it. Sometimes there's a disqualification, but it seems Judaism and halacha is as concerned, if not more concerned, with who it is who does it. And that at the end of the day, Judaism doesn't have the same element of accuracy required, but it depends on who it is who's overseeing it. So, for example, at a wedding, if a mistake is found in the ketubah, you rewrite the ketubah. If it turns out that you didn't have kosher witnesses because the witnesses weren't valid, then you may not have a wedding. But that's not a problem in the act of witnessing. That's a problem in who the witnesses were and whether they met the accepted religious and halachic criteria. So it seems very often that there's a different element of accuracy, not an accuracy of the actions exclusively, but the propriety of the people involved in the first place. And that, I think, is, we see that because while Judaism does not always require proper intent for fulfillment of commandments, mitzvot shvichot kavana is an ideal. It's not necessarily essential, right? If a person wanders off mentally during davening, you still consider davening for the most part. Might not be the best davening, but you did it. However, leading the services, the person has to be bar mitzvah, right? Leading a minyan, it has to be a man. There's certain personal requirements that need to be fulfilled for something to take place. So for example, according to halacha, that the mohel has to be an observant Jew, right? If the mohel was not an observant Jew, there's something lacking about the circumcision, even if it was done physically 100% accurate. There's that element of that level of accuracy, the idea that it's the messenger, even more than the message, that has to be, that creates that structure. So I think that that's something that, when we think about examples of where accuracy is required, we want accuracy. It doesn't have the same fundamental fault or failing in the system of the legal, except where it's the person who themselves is deficient. Questions, comments, or reactions, and I just want to look at one observation of where the Jewish community is at these days.
Rabbi, I noticed at a wedding that when the ring is placed on the finger, the rabbi says word by word to the groom what to say, the 9 words. It's probably because the groom may be nervous or to concentrate. Right. But if there's an error in those words, what is the ruling?
No, it really, really, I think they're married. It's tradition. Tevye, was right about a lot of things, including tradition. If you change those words around, for example, it's always like when you sometimes they'll recite in Hebrew and in English because maybe the bride or groom doesn't fully understand the Hebrew words. It's kind of like, behold, you are betrothed to me with this ring, according to the laws of Moses and Israel. Do they both know what betrothed means? Like, it's not a word that we use in all the time. So I think that it is important, and this is something that, I think it touches exactly upon this issue. It's important for the bride and groom both to know what that giving of the ring is about, more than the actual declaration being enunciated exactly with that formulation. And I think that's why it's important. My personal practice before officiating at a wedding is to just review with the groom and the bride what's taking place, that the act of marriage is taking place when the ring is given by the groom to the bride in the presence of valid witnesses. And in situations that unfortunately we encounter in halachic Judaism, the aguna situation, where a husband refuses to give his wife a get. Right, it happens the other way around as well, where the wife refuses to accept, but it's more common and more complex and difficult when the husband refuses to give the wife a get. There have been situations where, to obviate the need for a get, they will look and see whether this process, there was any fault in this process. Maybe the witnesses didn't see the ring, or maybe the witnesses weren't valid witnesses. So you see that it's not always the action of the ritual that is determinative as much as it is the intent, the understanding, and the requirements of the people.
I have 2 questions. It's Ruthie.
Sure.
Is it really the witnesses? What about like the Masada Kedushin? He has no requirement to be.
It's a very good question. On some level, the Masada Kedushin there are no requirements. Ultimately, the role of Misader Kedushin, as the name implies, is the one who's supposed to arrange and oversee. He creates the Seder. He makes sure, like the sitter, he makes sure that everything's going according to halacha, but it doesn't have to be a rabbi, right? And I think that in general, there's a conversation as to, any of the blessings that are part of the wedding ceremony, can they be recited by women or not, is a larger halachic debate. I think the consensus is that the Misader Kedushin, those blessings that are recited by the Misader Kedushin, have to be recited by a man. But kind of like the officiant, the person, we sometimes think of the Misader Kedushin as the officiant, the one who explains things and instructs things. That's really not, what's making the Kedushin. What makes the Kedushin is the giving of the ring with the two valid witnesses.
And the other question is, as far as like a scribe and what about tefillin? Is that like, I know because we're busy, we bought tefillin for my grandson, and like someone said, you can't just go into a Judaica store. You're not getting good tefillin.
Right. Well, the person who says that is the sofer who has his own store. No, but but no. So there's truth to that. I think that one of these days, when I like to explore the sociological and historical story of tefillin in America, right? Because I have the tefillin that my grandfather had, that are basically, it looks like they have bubblegum wrappers inside, right? They're not real parchments, and how it developed now, it's understandable how it developed. There are people who weren't as careful, or people who weren't as concerned with the validity of tefillin. I also think tefillin were probably not 100% widespread with every adult Jewish male in, let's say, the 13th, 14th, 15th century. It's not easy to get a pair of tefillin. Right now, we live in a wonderful world of religious article accessibility that, people can have two pairs of tefillin very easily. It could be expensive, but it's not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. So I think that you can't just go get a pair of tefillin, but there is a certain reliability that, can be discerned by going to a Judaica store. Who's the proprietor? Who's the one who sells you the tefillin? Is it the cashier? The 20-year-old kid is the cashier who sells you the tefillin, or is there someone who is conversant and knowledgeable of the laws of tefillin who purchased this store's supply of tefillin?
Right. I guess what I'm asking, I'm assuming it's the same requirement of perfection like a Sefer Torah.
There's a certain level of accuracy, and it's a good point as a good, I guess, addendum to what we're talking about. One of the things that we didn't speak about with regard to accuracy is physical accuracy. The tefillin is supposed to be square, to the 100th of the millimeter square or square, right? Yeah, the likelihood is regular because they didn't have the same levels of measurement or precision. The other is timing. We spoke a little bit about Jewish time in the past, right? Shabbat begins at sunset, which is an exact time, right? So there is a certain element of accuracy, but I think these are some certain levels of accuracy that are a little bit out of our control, right? And to protect ourselves against making mistakes, at least for time, we always, light candles a little earlier and Shabbos a little later. When it comes to some of these measurements, we rely sometimes on the experts. But yeah, so I think that tefillin is in the same category as a Torah scroll. Phyllis, you have a hand up.
Yes. Is it true that the wedding officiant usually says to the groom, you say Lee, because otherwise the officiant would be married to the bride?
Yes, you have to remember here also you have, my favorite is when the officiant is guiding the groom to recite the words and the groom is looking at the officiant and says, behold, you are betrothed to me, while looking at the rabbi. So it's, so I think it's in general, there's a certain element of intent and understanding that surrounds this. Also remember, the one who's the betrothed is the one giving the ring. So you don't really have to worry so much about the rabbi because the rabbi's not giving the ring. But you're right, this whole ritual, it really depends on the principles being aware of what's going on in addition to the actual recitation of formula. So just in terms of that last couple of lines in the article about, should you think this is overly legalistic, right? That resonates from a halachic perspective where it is a ritualistic technical, practical, legal system. And there was a book recently written that describes kind of the Jewish philosophical tradition, and highlighting that there's always been a focus on Jewish thought, and in particular in Judaism today, the typical modern Jew is interested more in Jewish thought than in Jewish law. And Rabbi David Wolpe, a prominent conservative rabbi from Los Angeles, wrote a review on that book, and source number 10 is a snippet. Jewish thinkers were once more preoccupied with explaining what God commands than why. That there were commandments and a legal system that spelled them out was not really in doubt. This was not just a matter of theory, it was a matter of social fact. Jews lived in communities in which observance of the mitzvot was a way of life. However, once the life of mitzvot is not a communal given, and the notion of a divine being who cares about what one eats becomes difficult to believe, the burden on Jewish religious thinkers is not merely to find symbolic or pragmatic reasons for the commandments, but to justify them as commandments at all. Because he, or the authoritative tradition he authorized, said so, no longer serves as the main problem, is only secondarily the male pronoun. The idea that, for example, Maimonides was explaining Judaism philosophically, the milieu was one of observance of commandments. It didn't have to be explained, oh, Judaism is a religion of commandments, because people were keeping them. And then Maimonides was able to infuse a little bit more thought, a little bit more meaning. That's no longer the case, because it's not just, you can't take the fact that you can't take the fact that Jewish commandments are essential to Judaism, because most Jews don't think so. Thus, most modern Jewish thinkers have turned from explanations of obedience to ideologies of encouragement. You should make this practice part of your life for the following reasons. But none of these reasons is as compelling as a divine command. Liberal theology, to some extent even Orthodox theology, has been a series of attempts to craft a rationale that delivers some sense of obligation. Yet you should will never be as compelling as you must. And although there are, as evidence in this theology, serious and brilliant contemporary liberal Jewish thinkers, the number of serious liberal Jews is shrinking. Thus, many Jews find that what they believe cannot be transmitted, and what can be effectively transmitted, they cannot believe. Like that last line, a sense of, if you think Jewish and feel Jewish, that's great, but that you can't necessarily pass that forward. And rituals, and our children and grandchildren doing the rituals, sometimes you can't necessarily explain those, and that gets passed on. And so I think that there's something to be said that that you need to remind people that this is the rule, and it may not make as much sense, but we do it anyway. That may have carried a lot more weight in previous centuries, but that remains a challenge today, to highlight that it is the law that is what connects us to the continuity, as much, probably more so, than the ability to understand why and its religious significance. And we've talked about this before. That the law and the spirit, the body and the soul, it requires a kind of a synthesis and a harmony between the two, rather than focusing on one or the other. But and that's why, whether it be for the baptism where with a mistaken word, or within the Jewish tradition at times, why the legality of the subject matters, and whether it's the way the Torah scroll is written, or whether it's the religious observance of the witness, which is important to determining whether the marriage is valid or not. These are all significant, even if they don't necessarily seem that's the way it should be. And